All right, welcome to Harvey Kaye. Already back for another episode. It hasn't been very long, but it's for an important reason. Harvey Kaye is Professor Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay. That's what it is, and also the author of the FDR and the Four Freedoms: What Made the Greatest Generation Truly Great. Also, and we'll get to this just very briefly as well. Thomas Paine and the Promise of America.
Yeah, we're
Um,
we're not going to talk that today, are we? I thought we are going to.
nope,
Which are
no,
we
no.
talking
We're gonna
today?
talk FDR, but I just since it will be Thomas's Paine's birthday as well, I was wondering if you could just start and since he's like the prototypical Democrat, he's like an early version of
Prototypical. He's the radical. He's
right,
not.
right,
He's like he'd be so outraged with the Democrats right now that
right. And
there's
but I
no
feel
way he
like
could subscribe to their mediocrity right now.
I feel
So
like
yeah,
since it
let me. I'll say a few things about Thomas Paine. Then we can
right,
talk
yep,
about FDR and democracy, FDR and the Four Freedoms.
yep,
And the reason we're going to talk about both is that this Friday, and this is very going to be brief.
yep.
This Friday is Thomas Paine's birthday. So I make it a point of celebrating that as every year. Sometimes, well, in the past, I used to go down to Sarasota, Florida, to to speak to an annual Thomas Paine's birthday dinner and dance hosted by Florida Veterans for Common Sense, a progressive veterans group down in Sarasota, Florida. But we haven't gone down the last few years. They are holding a party, however, I will say, on Zoom in February. Yeah, so I'll try to drop in by way of the Zoom, and they give their annual Thomas Paine Award, and this year they're giving it to Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who was the
Oh,
whistleblower on the whole Ukraine quest stuff, and you know, basically Trump took out his revenge on Vindman, but of course in the end Trump lost. So much the better. Okay, so Thomas Paine, who was, in fact, you might say, the godfather, if not the father of the United States. Yeah, I know he called George Washington the father, but it really, is many ways, is Thomas Paine, because it was Thomas Paine who not only in his pamphlet Common Sense of January 76 first called for the independence, that is, that the colonial rebellion should not just be to renegotiate the colonial relationship, but actually should be about a struggle for independence. But as Paine himself said, if it was only for independence, it really wouldn't have mattered very much. What was really important, as he laid it out in Common Sense, is that Americans had it in their power to begin the world over again. And in his terms, that meant that Americans had it in their power to create an unprecedented democratic republic. And, the revolution became a revolution not simply for independence, but also to create that democratic republic. Paine also went on to write a series of pamphlets known as the Crisis Papers to sustain the morale of Americans, especially the troops, during the revolution. He then went on, I'm going to leave out a lot of his writings, but he then went on, got involved in the French Revolution, and wrote Rights of Man, a 2-volume pamphlet, really, in which he not only defended the French Revolution and attacked British monarchy once again, but also held up America as an example of what a revolution could be about, a democratic republic. He also wrote Age of Reason, which was a 2-volume pamphlet in which he criticized organized religion. He was not an atheist, he was a deist. And he believed that if we really wanted to be moral in our lives, so we should emulate God's gift to humanity, which was the creation. And he was literally attacked no end for generations because of his claim that the Bible was not truth, and that indeed, he, as I said, he did believe in God, but that God was a unitary figure. Then beyond that, he also wrote, and this is really important, and then we can sort of end on this with one last note, is that Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called titled Agrarian Justice. And in there, without going into details, he outlines the very idea and vision of what we come to know of as Social Security. So he's not only a revolutionary Democrat with a small d, he's also really the pioneering figure in social democracy, the 19th and especially 20th century struggle for social democracy. And I'll just add that the powerful, the property, the prestigious, and the pious for generations really did everything in their power to suppress America's memory of Thomas Paine and his arguments, of his life and labors, because they so feared the radicalism of his pen. They were convinced that his radicalism persisted within American life, and that to read his work would in some ways be to once again encourage Americans to a more radical kind of politics. And yet they couldn't suppress the memory, because in every generation, from the very beginning to recent times, well, really into the 60s, those who we would think of as progressives or radicals or fighting liberals, that is the left, reached back and laid claim to Thomas Paine and his work, and in essence, to identify themselves with the revolution and the promise that ends up being stated in the Declaration of Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. So celebrate this Friday. If you're under 21, I'll leave it to you to decide how you want to celebrate. If you're over 21, I think a beer, a scotch, or a glass of wine in a toast would be a very nice gesture.
Absolutely. And I think that perfectly introduces the four freedoms and FDR, since FDR is sort of, maybe he's the most known social democratic figure in American history, Um,
Yeah, well, I mean, let's put it this way: you're always good, Brady, at introducing a thought that I can then expound upon.
yeah,
Just so you know, yeah, definitely, he is the foremost social democratic president we've ever had. Lincoln was something of a social democrat too. People don't quite appreciate it, but FDR really was. He didn't use the term social democracy; he used the term liberal, and he gave it a whole new meaning, which would have compared to European social democracy. But when he signed into law Social Security, when he signed into law the National Labor Relations Act, when he signed into law the Fair Labor Standards Act, when he encouraged his own cabinet to go out and encourage Americans to organize not only in labor unions, but also to organize what came to be known as the housewives movement of women from New York all the way out to California, including rural women in North and South Dakota. And what was their project? Basically, to keep an eye on business to make sure that they didn't raise their prices and to try to take advantage of people. And they worked in tandem with farmers' movements and with labor unions. So, I mean, he really is. Oh, by the way, he also signed into law the Rural Electrification Act, I guess it was called, in which he established an agency that pursued the electrification of Southern and Midwestern, but especially Southern households, farmsteads that did not have electricity. You know, Southern power companies were making plenty of money, and they resisted the idea of giving family farmers electricity because they didn't think they could charge enough to make it worthwhile. So FDR not only signed into law the initiative to create the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was the whole series of dams and projects in Tennessee and Alabama along the Tennessee, I guess it was the Tennessee Valley itself that covers those states, that provided thousands upon thousands of jobs, power in the poorest region of the South, you might say, one of the poorest regions of the South, but also this Rural Electrification Agency administration, whatever it was called specifically, and they basically created electric power lines to homesteads, rural homesteads, I think to the tune of 400 or 500,000 homes and farms received electricity, because he knew that if the private corporations weren't going to do it, that required public initiative. So over and over again, he really is the social democratic president.
absolutely. And actually, that's a good place to jump off to. So you were saying, well, actually, first of all, let's just first of all define. I want you to say what the four freedoms were, each of them, and then just sort of explain what that meant, because these are just words, right?
Yeah,
and
sure.
and
Well, but
yep,
but as you know, words matter. So let's make sure
right,
people know what they refer to.
exactly.
So let me put it in the context of FDR's vision, basically, of America and the world. So FDR ran for president the first time in 1932, and the United States and the world, the United States perhaps worst of all, was in the midst of a terrible depression, Great Depression, capital G and capital D. And that depression led to an unemployment rate approaching 30%, for African Americans approaching 50%. Um, I mean, people were losing their homes, they were losing their farms. Teenagers were told by their parents they had to get out of the house because the parents couldn't afford to protect them and feed them and all of that. And maybe several 100,000 teenagers hit the road during the 1930s. When people lost their homes, they ended up creating shacks that came to be called Hoovervilles outside of towns and cities. So when FDR ran, he started to outline projects that he had already begun to pursue as governor of New York from 1928 to 1932. And, he talked about the imperative of addressing the American environment, providing jobs, creating power for rural areas that didn't have it, protecting workers' rights, those who did have collective bargaining rights, and that they were very few, but at least making sure that unions were not going to be besieged all the more, aggressively by big business. So he laid all this stuff out, and he also included a vision of Social Security, which of course connects Franklin Roosevelt back to Thomas Paine in the 1790s. So Roosevelt gave this really remarkable speech. I mean, we all know his speeches. Um, well, we don't all know his speeches. We know the greatest of his speeches: the Pearl Harbor Day speech, the speech in which he takes the presidency in 1933, where he says, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," in the midst of the Depression, and also his speech at the Democratic Convention in 1932, where he lays out and uses the term "a New Deal." Okay, this is crucial. What people don't realize is that I guess it was October of 1932, he gave a speech out in California at the Commonwealth Club, which was a club of very prominent men in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he actually called for the creation of an economic declaration of rights. That was in 1933. So that basically a new Declaration of Independence that would empower working people and small business people against the big corporate titans, the big moguls of industry, you might say. And this really, in many ways, frames the entire administration. And, the New Deal ensues in 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38. And in 1939, war broke out in Europe between the fascists, okay, Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, versus France and Britain. And France was overrun. And by by the end of 1940, Britain was practically the only democracy left in all of Europe. And FDR gave a fireside chat. These were these radio talks that he would give regularly. And he said the United States had to turn itself into the arsenal of democracy and had to lend Britain the kinds of materials and supplies and armaments that would enable Britain to survive the German blitzkrieg, the Nazi attack that was taking place. That was in December, late December of 39 that he gave that speech. But then in the beginning of that was 1940, not 39. In the beginning of 1941, in what we now call the State of the Union address, he gave a speech that's come to be known as the Four Freedoms speech, which he warns Americans again of the possibility of being attacked by the Nazis, the fascists generally. And he said they're not going to warn us. And we really do need to supply Britain with the wherewithal to withstand the German attack. And then he shifts gears a little bit and he says, but this doesn't mean we're going to stop pursuing the New Deal. We're going to continue to make sure that Americans are better fed and better clothed, that they get. In fact, he actually mentions healthcare in that speech. And then again, he sort of doesn't pause so much as he shifts the gear a little bit. And he offers a vision of America and the world after the war. The war we haven't even gotten directly into, but this speech in many ways is a call to Americans, a call to arms, to defend ourselves, to provide what we need to withstand a fascist attack, and to provide Britain with what it needs in order to persist. And he says, we look forward to a world characterized by four fundamental freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression. The second is freedom of worship or freedom of religion. The third, and this is where he shifts, listen to the prepositional shift, freedom from want. And last, freedom from fear. Now, the words he used in those speeches were heard by Americans as a promise. This is what we're about, and this is what we're going to look to secure. Now, freedom of speech and expression and freedom of worship are already indicated in the First Amendment of the Constitution, the first of the Bill of Rights, okay, where there are four freedoms indicated: religion, speech, press, and assembly. And what Roosevelt basically was doing is he was reaffirming our historic commitment to pursue those freedoms in those first two of the four freedoms. But Americans also heard that as a promise that they would be safe on the streets, no matter which religion they practiced, that they not only to pray in a church or a synagogue or whatever or wherever, but also they would be safe at home in America. Now, when he spoke of freedom from want and freedom from fear, they heard him even more radically than he spoke. Because what he said is freedom from want will create a world in which all nations will have the economies in which they're capable of providing for their citizens. And last but not least, freedom from fear, which would be a control on armaments to limit the capacity of any nation to make war on other nations. Okay. When Americans heard those two, freedom from want and freedom from fear, they believed that that was a promise that they would continue to pursue the New Deal. Okay, that's first of all. And also that they would pursue the New Deal in a way so that we would not, so that we would enable other countries, okay, to provide food, clothing, and shelter for themselves. I mean, this is an important kind of guarantee. And then the freedom from fear, this is really important. When Americans heard that, if they were African American, it seemed they were being promised that we were going to bring an end to Southern segregation and Northern segregation to the extent that it existed in a social sense, and that moreover, they would be protected against, well, what we would think of as not just discrimination, but serious, call it in their minds Black Lives Matter for the 1940s, you might say, okay? And similarly, Jews and others who were minorities in this country similarly heard that freedom from fear was a promise that they would be able to, that they would be not only full citizens, but they would be guaranteed protections against mobs, against racists, against Klansmen, white supremacists, that kind of. So when Americans heard these four freedoms, they heard it not necessarily as a guarantee for the world, which is what FDR tried to project, but that America would truly start to live up to the promise of all men are created equal and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the promise of the First Amendment of the Constitution. Now, FDR didn't stop at that. And this is the other interesting part of it, is that within 3 years, and during the war, by the way, that became, if you like, the manifesto of the American war effort, the Four Freedoms. And progressive groups grabbed hold of it, African American groups, labor unions, the women's movement. I mean, it really did become the key idea of the war effort. We knew not only what we were fighting against, we knew what we were fighting for. Well, in 1944, again in January of 1944, this is where FDR takes that original Economic Declaration of Rights idea and the call for the four freedoms, the promise of the four freedoms, and if in some ways he gives them even more substance, more life. He calls on Americans in 1944 to continue to pursue the war effort. The war's not over yet. We could see victory ahead in Europe. The possibility of an even longer war in Asia against Japanese militarism was likely. And he warned Americans not to start slacking off in the war effort, material production, in supporting the troops overseas. And then he says, in a way, we can look now also to what we want to promise ourselves after the war. And he begins by reminding Americans that in the wake of 8 years of the New Deal and what we've accomplished in the war effort, that we know that needy people are not free people. They're just not free. If you're needy, you are not free. And he lays out, simply put, a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights, okay, which includes, the promise of housing, the promise of sufficient food, the food, clothing, shelter, a guarantee of national health care,
Yep.
okay, guarantee of education up to the point to which you're capable of pursuing it and desire to pursue it, a reasonable return on investment, even for business, reasonable, not outrageous.
Yep.
Okay. Protection of farmers that they can pursue their, their cultivation and harvesting in a comfortable and reasonable manner. I'm paraphrasing all of this.
Mm-hmm.
He even makes a promise that in this new America there will be a promise of recreation, which is kind of like an echo of the original idea of the labor movement. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours for what we will, meaning 8 hours to pursue happiness. And that's why recreation is essential. So, I mean, it was really a remarkable speech. Now, he knew the Republicans would not buy into it, at least not the majority of them. And he knew that big business would oppose it. Okay. In fact, he actually warned Americans to watch out for some elements in the capitalist class that were really right wingers and would try to completely undo even the advances of the New Deal.
Yeah.
But the key thing here, I know I've gone on, but I want people to understand the key thing here is that he knew Americans wanted that economic Bill of Rights
Right.
because because they had done you know surveys and polls. They had been asking Americans, what do you want after the war? What do you want to pursue after the war? And to give you just one example of just how social democratic minded Americans were, 83, 85 at the most, but 83% of Americans wanted national health care, a guarantee of health care coverage. And by the way, that was like 95% of Democrats and 75% of Republicans, which is to
Yeah.
say, an overwhelming majority of all Americans wanted it. So, if you think about it, the Roosevelt administration years from 33 to 45, he was elected to the presidency 4 times. He died in the first year of his 4th term, is really about pursuing social democracy.
Awesome. So just one more thing that this is maybe for looking forward into the future and what we can sort of take away from what FDR did while he was president. In your book, you describe when FDR called to build this New Deal society, right?
Yeah,
He called for people to help him build these institutions, and all these new dealers signed up in mass to staff these new agencies
right.
or do these public work projects. And it seems like I in my opinion that was like the biggest thing that I took from your book on what the left should sort of take from FDR is this idea of like building institutions that maybe didn't exist there before, using your power to establish new things, whether it's like community aid or public works projects or public housing, you know. Could you speak to that and how that all took place?
Yeah. Well, in favor of tweeting recently, I came to the point of saying, FDR's presidency, the New Deal presidency, and the war effort presidency, it really involved 4 R's. It was, I'll state each of them and then I'll explain what I mean. Relief, reconstruction, reconstruction, reform, and recovery. So, relief is that immediate imperative to make sure people can survive. And I'll put it in contemporary terms, our own terms today. That's so if Joe Biden pursues anything in the first weeks and months of the presidency that he's just now secured, it has to be combating the pandemic. And in those terms, combating the unemployment, enabling Americans who have jobs to get back to work. Okay, that's for a start. Relief, we'll call it. He calls it, I think, a rescue plan, but it's relief. The second, reconstruction, is to launch major public works projects. Okay. And there we can refer to the Civilian Conservation Corps that young men and boys were invited into, the Civil Works Administration, which provided emergency relief, you might say, in that early years of this administration. But beyond that, the Works Progress Administration, which was a massive set of endeavors to do everything from building roads to building hospitals to building schools to building parks, and to get involved even in even more grander, if you like, kinds of projects. And then the other one was the PWA, the Public Works Administration, which gave contracts to pursue the construction of dams, big bridges, tunnels, that kind of stuff. I mean, the American landscape was transformed during the New Deal, and the national infrastructure was modernized. As we said before, rural electrification and that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's Reconstruction. And by the way, part of that Reconstruction involved combating, you and I are both here in the upper Midwest, but the
Yep.
lower Midwest, the plain states, suffered a terrible droughts in the 1930s. Whole stretches of Oklahoma and Kansas and maybe Texas were turned into a dust bowl. So they also fought that by planting massive numbers of trees. The CCC and other agencies planted like 3 billion trees in the course of the Roosevelt years. Okay, then there's reform. And this is really important, okay? Reform would be, for example, the fact that the Roosevelt administration, from the very start in the National Industrial Recovery Act, and even more significantly in the National Labor Relations Act, signed into law the guarantee that government would enable and empower workers to organize labor unions, to stand up to their bosses, and to pursue what's called industrial democracy, giving workers a voice not only in contracts, but in the workplace itself. And similarly, the enactment of Social Security, that realization, something that he had promised to pursue, to not publicly, but he had promised actually, he did talk about creating Social Security even as he was campaigning. And in 1935, he signed into law the Social Security Act, which basically was to combat poverty amongst the elderly, to do something about protecting families with a single parent household. I mean, and also to enable the disabled, to pursue lives that were decent. Okay, so it was multifaceted. And then last but not least, and I used to think of it as the first thing they pursued, was recovery. But now I'm actually convinced that recovery was impossible without also having done relief first, without pursuing reconstruction and providing jobs and getting that economy moving and enabling America to rebuild itself, and reform, empowering workers, because by empowering workers, you enabled them to demand higher wages. And when they demanded higher wages, it meant that farmers could sell their products to survive at reasonable prices. And also, and this is really important, it meant that factories could be reopened, okay, not only to provide jobs, but that people could afford to buy what they were producing. So there you go, 4 R's: relief, reconstruction, reform, and recovery. Those are the 4 R's, I think, especially of the New Deal years. But I'll also add, labor unions grew even larger, and because in the war years, okay, workers wanted to be organized. They wanted the dignity that labor provided. They wanted the protection that unions could provide in the workplace. And especially during the war effort years, women who had already been involved in unionism were an ever larger base of the union movement, because of the fact that so many men were being called into service to fight the war.
Awesome, Harvey. Thank you for breaking this down for me. Thank you for
Pleasure.
coming on and talking. I loved your book, FDR,
Well, hold on.
The Four Freedoms. Oh
Yep.
yeah, you want to put that above your shoulder again?
I'll just show everybody. Can they see that now or
Awesome.
not?
Yep, yep.
The fight for the 4 freedoms. What made FDR and the greatest generation truly great? I'll just tell you, that medal is the medal that everyone, man and woman, received at the end of the war effort. Anyone who served in uniform during World War II in the United States military received that. Now, the medal itself, and I have a couple sitting here on my desk. I bought them on eBay. My father received the Purple Heart because he fought in the Battle of the Bulge, but somewhere along the way, he lost this particular medal, so I didn't have his own. But on the back side of the medal, it actually says the Four Freedoms. It's called the Four Freedoms Medal in honor to commemorate the war effort and those who served in it.
You know what's interesting?
And then there's this other one over my
Oh
shoulder.
yeah, talk about
It
that.
just came out this past year, FDR and Democracy. I wanted to really remind everyone, so I collected the speeches of Roosevelt that really do indicate his commitment to the development of democracy. And I will tell you, he's more radical than he's been portrayed by not only liberals, but even by progressives, because FDR was more than not happy. He was determined, in part, to redistribute the wealth of the United States, not by just handing out checks. He didn't believe in that, but by taxing the rich to help create that reformation, that rebuilding of the national infrastructure,
Mhm.
which is why the rich hated him so much.
Right, right. You know what's interesting? My grandma's brother got a Purple Heart, and I found this document he wrote. It's about 20 pages long about his time in World War II
Mm.
and his time after that. And I found out that he worked closely with the Shah of Iran after we overthrew Mossadegh.
Oh.
And
In 1954.
Yep. My
Oh, well,
grandma's.
please. I mean, I honor his service in World War II, but
Oh,
overthrowing the Shah is something. Oh, geez.
trust me, and what he called the great emperor Selassie in
Oh, in Ethiopia.
yep, Ethiopia, right?
Oh, so
And
he was probably in OSS and then the CIA.
yep, well, yeah, that's what I told my grandma was I respect. It's he didn't realize it, but he was fighting for empire, and like
Yeah,
I don't think
yeah.
I think he thought he was fighting for.
When he fought in World War II, he was fighting fascism.
Right,
But then
exactly.
later up, but later he was obviously he
He's
was
working for
undermining
some questionable
democracy
people.
overseas.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you know what's interesting is I came across a photo in there of of him and his two daughters that were, I think they were both under 10 at that time,
Yeah,
and
that
his
would make sense.
wife riding camels with the Shah.
Well, let me put it this way.
Yeah.
Brady, you know how much I appreciate your efforts, but you just added a downer to a good discussion of the four freedoms.
FDR, so you don't end up riding camels with the Shah.
With the Shah, right,
Yeah.
right.
No, but it was interesting to see that stuff. But he did get a Purple Heart as well. He also talked about meeting Hubert Humphreys and speaking.
Well, you're
Apparently,
a Minnesotan. Humphrey
yeah,
was the foremost liberal progressive figure in Minnesota for many years.
met him in Nigeria.
Well, that's funny.
Yeah,
That's funny
and
because you're from Minnesota. Your family's in Minnesota, and he met him overseas. Yeah, that
right,
happens. That
yeah.
happens. Right.
Alrighty, well, we'll end this here. Actually, is there anything you want to plug, like your Twitter again?
Oh yeah. So if anybody wants to follow me and send me a question, I'm on Twitter at Harvey Harvey, initial Jkaye, Harvey JK. There are, by the way, people say, why do I use the middle initial? There
Mhm.
are other Harvey Kays.
Yeah,
In fact, I'll provide a quick story just to lighten to lighten the discussion after your great uncle's work. Um,
family history of empire. Yeah,
this but about 30 years ago, even it's hard to remember when exactly, but I got a phone call from a leading women's magazine asking if they could interview me. And I said, well, are you aware of the work I do? I mean, why would you want to interview me? And then I indicated to them that, that I wrote about, British and American radicals.
yeah.
And they said, oh, but we thought you wrote about manhood. And I said, what? And it turned out there was, I think it's a Harvey K, something like that,
Oh, okay.
who had books on manhood, something to that
Mhm.
effect. And then there was another Harvey K who's written about international trade, and then another one maybe negotiations. So don't get confused. It's Harvey Kaye. Okay.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you.